Hey everybody, it's Lon.TV, and today we're taking a look at Parallels for Mac 18, and this is software that allows you to boot up Windows on your Mac device. And of course, Macs are now running with what they call Apple Silicon, which is an ARM-based platform, very different from the Intel platform that previously drove these Macs. But there is a version of Windows that runs on ARM hardware. There are a small number of Windows computers powered by Snapdragon processors, and that version of Windows gets installed with Parallels, and you can switch back and forth very quickly between your Mac desktop and your Windows desktop. And you'll notice that the notch here on the Mac doesn't translate very well, so they just have a larger border there on the screen. But nonetheless, it boots up quite quickly. And in this video, we're going to look at how well Windows runs on the M1 Mac, what you can do with it, and some things you have to think about if you are looking at upgrading from an Intel Mac and running Windows software is still very important to you. Now, before we jump into this video, I do want to let you know, in the interest of full disclosure, that I paid for the Mac with my own funds, but Parallels did provide me with a key for 18. This is the Pro Edition, and I'll talk about the differences between the Pro and the Standard as we work our way through the video here. But they do have a 7-day trial if you wanted to try it out for yourself. All the opinions you're about to hear are my own. They are not paying for this review, nor have they reviewed or approved what you're about to see before it was uploaded. So let's get into it now and see how Parallels for the Mac works with the ARM version of Windows 11. Now, the price point for Parallels Desktop is about $100 for the Standard Edition and $120 for the Pro Edition. There are some differences between the Standard and the Pro. I think for most people that are looking to boot up Windows on their computer, the big difference here is the amount of RAM and CPU cores you can use for your virtual machines. So on the Standard Edition, they max you out at 8 gigabytes of RAM and 4 CPU cores. On the Pro Edition, you can go up to 128 gigabytes of RAM with 32 cores. Now, I did mention at the outset that we were running this on M1, but this in fact is the M2 MacBook Air. And I'm finding in my testing that the Standard Edition is fine for this Mac because this one has 16 gigabytes of RAM and it has an 8-core CPU, but it doesn't seem to do very well when you go beyond 4 in the parallel setup, and that's due to how Apple has configured these CPU cores. I actually saw my benchmark tests go lower when I added more cores to the mix versus the 4 that it was defaulting to. So I think for folks that are running with a MacBook Air or one of the base model M1 or M2 processors, the Standard Edition here is fine. But there are some additional features that might be appealing to developers that the Pro Edition offers. One note is that the Pro Edition does come as a subscription only, so you do have to pay every year to run the software. Another factor here is that you do need to purchase a Windows 11 license if you intend on running Windows 11 inside of your virtual machine. It will continue to run without being licensed, but you will get bugged with a Activate Windows notification on the lower right-hand portion of your screen that pops up periodically, and that would appear when you're doing a PowerPoint presentation or anything. It doesn't go away, so if you wanted to make sure that your copy of Windows is legal and legit, you'll probably have to spend a little bit more to get that license purchased and applied to your installation. Now, the installation process is very simple on this. A little bit earlier on a live stream, we did install Windows 11 from scratch using the Parallels installation wizard. You just tell it you want to run Windows, it goes out and grabs the operating system from Microsoft and gets you up and running, probably within about 20 or 30 minutes, depending on how fast your internet connection is. Now, once you have Windows up and running, you'll find that a good portion of the Windows app library is going to run quite nicely for you, I think. This is the ARM-optimized version of Microsoft Word, and this will install by default if you do install the Office 365 suite on your Windows installation running on your Mac. It feels just as quick as it does on some of the other ARM-based Windows computers I have looked at recently. You'll also find, though, that Microsoft has made some real improvements in how Windows runs software designed for Intel and AMD processors. The first one I'm going to load up here is QuickBooks. This is actually an older version of QuickBooks. This is 2018, I believe. And this is an example of an application that might be something you need to run on your Mac because the clients you might be working with want you to run. a Windows version of QuickBooks on your computer, which this will allow you to do. And again, this software was written for a different type of architecture, but it's running in emulation here. And although QuickBooks has never been the fastest application that I've run on a Windows computer, it doesn't feel all that slow here. So running reports and just jumping around into different parts of the interface here feel pretty good. This is a sample company, by the way, and not my business, but you can get a feel for how that works. Now, this is a 32-bit application, and these ran fairly well on Windows 10 in the past, but the types of applications that did not work well on the Windows 10 ARM version were apps that were 64-bit apps. And I have an app here that I run for my amateur radio hobby that is a 64-bit Windows application that makes use of the soundboards and everything else. And it feels like it is running pretty nicely here and very similar to how it might run on a lower level mini PC or something. But still, you're able to boot these apps up and use them on your Mac using an ARM and not an Intel processor. And it's all seamless now as opposed to having to install beta versions of Windows like you used to have to do for the 64-bit applications. So if you're not trying to run games on here, it should, and I quote should, be able to run a good chunk of the kinds of work applications, either 32-bit or 64-bit, that were designed for Intel or AMD processors. And of course, most of the ARM apps should work nicely here as well. Now, before we move on to trying to play some games on this, I did want to give you some results of a benchmark test that I ran earlier called Geekbench. And on that test, we got a score of 1,499 on the single core test and 5,545 on the multi-core test. And that again is with this computer configured for 4 virtual cores. When I went up to 6 cores, the single core test was the same, but I scored about 1,000 less on the multi-core test there. But take another look at the chart, because when you compare this to most of the shipping Windows computers running with ARM processors, you can see that this MacBook Air running Windows virtually is right up there with one of the top-of-the-line ThinkPads running with a 3rd generation Snapdragon 8cX. So this Mac, which costs less than many of those ARM-based Windows laptops do, performs about the same as those do running Windows virtually. And of course, you have all of the Mac compatibility here as well, just by jumping back and forth. Now, what I'm doing right now is running Steam and installing some games. Gaming is much more problematic on Windows ARM versus what you would get with a true Intel or AMD-based laptop. And there's a really helpful website that I found called Apple Gaming Wiki. And here they are collecting information about people who are trying to run games on these Apple Silicon Macs. And you can see there is a parallels column here at the end, which indicates that the game might run perfectly with Parallels installed. They also look at Crossover, which is a Wine-based emulation means of running Windows games without having to install Windows itself. And then, of course, they also look for games that are ported to the Mac that might not yet be ported to Apple Silicon, but can run with Apple's own emulation layer called Rosetta 2. And then there are a number of games now that are for the Mac, native for Apple Silicon, and this list gets updated all the time. So if you have a few games that you want to play on your Mac that were written for Windows, I would go here first before you go out and do anything, because you might spend a lot of time, effort, and money buying a Mac, getting Parallels, getting the Windows license, and then find out your game doesn't run. So I will show you, though, a couple of games that do run on this platform, and we'll see how they perform. Let's boot up Half-Life 2 first. So we're going to be running all these games at 1920 by 1200, so we get kind of a comparative to a 1080p laptop experience like you would get on a standard Windows computer. So I'm going to jump into the Half-Life game here and see how it runs. It feels pretty good. It actually feels like it's running at a solid 60 frames per second here. The sound's working great. And again, this is not an Apple Silicon native game. This is not even a Windows ARM native game. This is running as a 32-bit emulated title here. But it's an older game, and it's running exceptionally well here, even though we do get occasional screen flickers that pop up. I was not able to get my frame counter to appear here, but as you can see, the game is running very, very smoothly. And I would say actually probably a little smoother than it did on some of the ARM-based Windows laptops that we've looked previously at. Let's take a look at another game. Now, the next game I attempted to run was No Man's Sky, and this one is, of course, a little more modern, and it is not yet compatible with ARM Macs, and you'll get this Vulkan initialization failure. This means that the Vulkan graphics library is not yet running well, or at all in this case, on these ARM-based Windows machines. And this is something I saw on the actual Windows ARM computers that I reviewed as well. I think we'll start to see this moving in a different direction soon, but for now, a lot of the AAA titles are going to be out of reach. This would also include titles like Red Dead Redemption 2 as well. All right, so here we are playing Ace Combat 7. We're running at 1080p at the lowest settings. Again, this is the Windows game running inside of our ARM Windows 11 virtual machine. And at lowest settings, we're getting about 30 frames per second here with some occasional lag hits, as you saw right there. And a Windows machine at a comparable price would run this game better. And of course, we'd have a lot more compatibility with other Windows games that don't run on here at all. So not ideal by any stretch, but there are some more current games that can be somewhat playable here, but this is not going to be a gaming solution by any means. Now, there are some different display options that you can use with Parallels, and some of these features have been with Parallels since the beginning. So right now we're in the full screen mode where I can jump back and forth between my Mac desktop and Windows desktop. This is how I prefer to run Windows because I like to know what operating system I am in at all times, and I don't like having everything mixed up together. But there are some things that you can do if you prefer to have your applications more seamlessly integrated. So what I've got here on the top of the screen is my Mac menu that I pulled up by putting my mouse up to the top here. And you can see that we are currently running Windows 11. And under the View option here, we have it right now in full screen. But if I click Exit Full Screen, what it's going to do is rescale into a window here. And you can see it actually rescaled the Windows graphics here as I move things around. That's because when you install Windows, they put on a special tool for having it detect these kinds of changes. Now, another option here, now that we exited full screen, is that we can enter something called Coherence mode. And what this does is it gets rid of the Windows desktop completely and allows your Windows applications to sit on top of your Mac desktop. So if you don't like jumping back and forth and you have just maybe one or two Windows apps that you're in all day, this might be one way to get a tighter integration. And as we get into the configuration components here, I'll show you how you can have your files linked up in this way as well. Now, they have another mode called Picture-in-Picture, and the way this is supposed to work is that if you have some Windows application that is doing something in the background that you want to monitor without getting buried under your other windows, what you do is go over here to View and say Enter Picture-in-Picture. And what it will do is shrink down your Windows display into this little window here. You can make it bigger or smaller. And it stays in the foreground and remains transparent so it doesn't get lost. And then if you wanted to jump back in, you can just close that up and then it goes back to windowed mode. I don't see a lot of utility for that, but I think there might be some areas where being able to monitor something like that in the corner of your screen might be useful. Now, there aren't many settings that you have to configure to get things up and running, but if you want to tweak how it works, you definitely want to spend some time going through your virtual machine's configuration. Now, you do that through the control center that Parallels will load up when you activate the application. Now, you'll see right now in my control center we have Windows 11 here, and this is currently running. And you can shut it down from here, although you do want to shut down your virtual machines properly by going through the Start menu and the Power button like you normally would on a Windows computer, but you can force it through here. You can also configure your virtual machine by clicking on the gear icon. If we had more virtual machines installed, maybe we have a second Windows installation or some Linux distributions, those would all appear here as a list, but right now we just have the one. I'm going to click on the gear icon, and you'll notice that we are currently running Windows 11, so some of these settings won't be able to be changed until we do a proper shutdown of the virtual machine. But you can see here, we could rename the virtual machine after we shut it down. We could add a description to it. If maybe this virtual machine is used for something specific, we can put a note in there. You also have the ability to reclaim space on your virtual hard drive, because as you delete files, it does still take up a little bit of physical space on the Mac until you do that file reclamation. If we go over to options here, you have the ability to see how some of the interactions between your Mac and the virtual machine take place here. So the big one that you should be focusing on is sharing, because by default, they put you into this mirror mode where your download folder, your desktop folder, all of that stuff is mirrored between the Mac and Windows. In some ways, this adds convenience because your downloads folder is in one place on both systems, but if you have some malware on the Windows side, it could impact some files on the Mac side. So you may want to decide to turn that off for security. But again, by default, if you just do the one-click install, it's going to mirror things to make it convenient. You also have the ability to share custom folders if you want. Maybe you want to have just a single folder somewhere other than your downloads or desktop where you're sharing that stuff, and that's something you might want to do there. Now, this next item is called Applications, and if you look down on the lower portion of my dock here, and I'll give you a better look at it now, you'll see that I've got my Windows applications here appearing alongside my Mac applications. And if you don't like that, what you can do is turn this off, and that will prevent those items from showing up in the dock when they're loaded. I believe what you will get is just the Windows 11 application itself, which would then bring you back over to your Windows desktop. But if you wanted to very quickly, in Coherence mode, for example, go back to Notepad, that dock click will bring you to Notepad, and it'll feel more like a Mac experience. One other thing you can do is click on Show Windows Applications folder in the dock, and what this will do is add a folder here to your dock, which will have all of your Windows applications in one spot, so you can very quickly load them up if you wanted to. So there's some fun things you can do there. And the old version of this used to just mash everything into your applications folder, so it's good to see that they've improved this a little bit. You can also set some other things here about sharing your Mac applications with Windows, so that when a Mac document appears on your Windows desktop, it'll go to the Mac version of that application if you wanted to do that. So you could spend some time in here just trying to get everything figured out. Hardware is pretty self-explanatory. This is where you can configure your virtual machine. Right now, because we are running, we can't adjust some of these things, but if you wanted to add or subtract cores, you would do that here. You can also set how the graphics work. We were using best for external displays when we were playing the games so that I could adjust the display resolution. By default, it leaves it as best for Retina display. And this is probably what you want to use if you are running Parallels applications on a laptop screen like this MacBook Air, because the translation between Retina scaling and Windows scaling often gets messed up, and Parallels just kind of handles that for you in the background. But if you are using external displays, you're going to spend some time over here messing around with that. You can share your mouse and keyboard, your printers. You can set what network devices are in use here, and of course you can isolate the network a little better than how I have it currently if you really want to keep the Mac and Windows side separate. You do have some sound options here along with Bluetooth and USB. You can add additional virtual hard drives to the mix after you shut down, so you could create a virtual hard drive that maybe you use across two different virtual machines, but I think it can only be mounted on one at a time. And then you have some settings here for the virtual CD-ROM drive. And what you can do here is mount ISO images as CD images, essentially. So you could use this perhaps to boot up a Linux distribution that is not part of the Parallels automatic install that we'll look at in a minute. And of course, other Windows-based software if you have them as a CD image. The TPM is kind of a new feature for Windows 11 because this is going to make things a little less convenient. If you're trying to run your Windows 11 virtual machine on another Mac, you have to transfer both the virtual machine and the TPM password to it, which you can find by reading in articles. So in the past, you used to be able to take your virtual machine on an external drive and just boot it up on another computer. Now there's a little bit of more work here involved in this TPM process. You won't have this issue running Linux distributions, but Windows 11, because it's so tightly intertwined now with this TPM stuff, is going to add some complexity to the mix. And then, of course, you can set your boot order for which virtual device will boot up that particular virtual machine. What I want to do now, though, is install Linux. We're going to go from scratch here, installing a version of Ubuntu, and it's pretty easy, just like the Windows side is. Let's have a look at that. All right, so I shut down our Windows 11 installation, and I'm going to go up here to File and New, and we get a warning here about how the M series chips work, because they are different than the Intel Macs. And as you can see, if I wanted to install another version of Windows, I would just click on the Windows thing and have at it. I can do a manual install with the second option there to the right, but we also have a number of free operating systems we can grab, and these are all the ARM versions of those operating systems. I'm going to go for Ubuntu Linux here and click on Continue. And what it's going to do now is download the Ubuntu operating system, and once that is downloaded, we'll be prompted to set up our virtual machine. Now, you can put the virtual machine on the hard drive of the computer by default, but you can also put it on a solid-state drive or any kind of external drive for that matter, so you can make this portable or just have it only there when you need it. And as you can see here, it's grabbing that installation here. It's making sure we've got a valid copy of it. And in a minute or two, we will be booting up Ubuntu without having to go through the process of finding the ISO for the operating system and configuring everything manually. And this is something that I really like a lot about this newer version of Parallels, in that it really takes a lot of the friction out of getting one of these operating systems installed and running. So I'm going to let this boot up here, and when it's done, we'll see how well Ubuntu runs on this system. All right, we are up and running now with the ARM version of Ubuntu, and this took maybe 5 minutes or so. That included the download. I would say, having just watched this process go through, you probably, as a serious Linux user, will want to download your own ISO and install from scratch. The reason is that it will install the Parallels tools automatically. It starts off with a username called Parallels as default. You really can't set up anything specific for a username that you would prefer, initially at least. So I think there are some defaults here that'll make some serious Linux users uncomfortable. But if you wanted to just try it out, maybe try a few different distributions to see which one works best on your Mac, this is probably a good way to try things out. The audio seems to work here. The screen did adjust resolution. I can pop it out of the full screen mode here, for example, and it will rescale like it was doing on Windows. It does not have the coherence mode on the Linux side, and I did notice some flakiness when I was jumping around into full screen mode and back. So for example, when I did this, there it goes again, did this full screen from the windowed mode, it did require me to log back in again, but it is able to really get you up and running very, very quickly if you wanted to try out a particular ARM-based Linux distro. And then you can also hit the plus icon here and try out Fedora and Debian and Kali, and you can even install another copy of Mac OS running virtually on the Mac as well, and I'm sure these will get updated over time. So if you want to try them out, I would definitely go this route. But if you are looking to do something mission critical, I would download the ISO from the official source and install it using the manual process here. But it looks like you can really get a lot of Linux going on your Mac here very, very quickly. So all in, Parallels here is super simple to get up and running. I am concerned that some of the default settings may not be the most secure settings if you are doing things that require isolation on the virtual machine side, so you'll want to be very careful about those settings. But all in, I'm very pleased with how everything is running here, and it's running really nicely on the base level MacBook Air as well. So lots of fun stuff to play around with here, and we'll probably be coming back to this topic again in the future. That's going to do it for now. Until next time, this is Lon.TV. Thanks for watching.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold level supporters Chris Allegretta, Brian Parker, Hot Sauce and Video Games, Baby Metal Fox God, Tom Albrecht, Amda Brown, Matt Zagaya, and Tech Time with Eric. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to Lon.TV/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit Lon.TV/s.